Hello, one, and welcome all. So, this is a video series I've been wanting to make for a very long time. I've made it no secret that I like to write novels here on this channel. I've even uploaded a few of them here in audiobook form. Well, I feel like I've learned a lot over the past 12 years, and that I've been writing and have tried to pass on advice here and there wherever it made sense. But I've never really fully sat down and said, this is gonna be where I dole out as many tidbits as I can possibly muster. Back on my old channel, before it got nuked, I did try to make a series similar to this, where it was kind of more live stream format, where I was editing one of my books at the time and giving as much advice as I could. I remember even taking advice from some of the kind folks in my Discord and compiled that into a video or two back then. I think both of those videos are lost to time, and for good reason. They weren't really effective. I think it's clear I'm best suited when I can sit down and organize my thoughts into something coherent without all of the filler words and phrases. That long diatribe out of the way, this is going to be a video series on how to write a novel. And there's going to be an asterisk at the end of that title there, because both fortunately and unfortunately, everybody writes books differently. Some people may resonate with my process and what I have to say, others may not. That's completely fine. Don't feel like you're a failure or not a writer because my way doesn't work for you. I have watched and read many a video or class like this very thing and felt like I didn't fit in as many of the categories they were placing me in, and that's totally okay. So, you want to write a novel, or a novella, or a short story, or what have you, even for an ARG series online. I'm sure many of the things that I talk about can be extrapolated to many different kinds of art forms where writing excels. But seeing as my specific passion lies in the novel, that's where most of the focus here will be on. I'm sure down the road I'll have some ARG-focused topics as I've been doing those. There are many questions that exist at the beginning of the process here. First of all is what kind of story you want to write. Now, if you're newer, this may seem dauntless. You may have so many ideas, or conversely, not enough ideas at all. And both of those extremes can be very overwhelming. The entire first part of this series is going to be focused on that very thing. Ideas. So if you've got a solid idea for what your work is all about, you can move on to the next video when and if it is available to watch. I think you might find some interesting things in here regardless, but if you're looking to go deeper on these ideas, this video isn't going to be going too deep on that specifically. Ideas are hard. They mean different things to different people. Carl Jung once mentioned that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And this quote really reframed a lot about how I think of ideas. I think ideas are as mutable as a ball of clay in front of you, held between your hands. The unmolded clay is the vessel in which an idea can be formed. It could be a giraffe, it could be the Mona Lisa, it could even be a towering clay model of Harambe himself. May he rest in peace. Each of those individual moldings can be molded by anybody. There is nothing about the Harambe recreation itself that requires, say, hypothetical artist A in order to bring it to life. If artist A gets the idea that they want to make clay Harambe, then artist A will do just that. If prompted, artist A might mention that they thought it was very funny, or a touching tribute to a legend. Or maybe they don't even know where the idea came from, that it just struck. And that, I think, is the key word. Striking like lightning. Ideas can sometimes just happen like that. Now, I mention this because thinking of ideas like this is supposed to be more freeing to you. It's supposed to inspire you that if you can get the right scenario going, where you're treating your imagination properly and giving yourself time and space, you too can be struck by an idea. That could be a giant Harambe made out of clay. There are some very important caveats that come with this information. Just because ideas get people, this does not take away the will or the artistry of the artist, nor is it a get-out-of-work-free card. Stories, novels, and everything thereafter are not ideas. Ideas are let's call them the infant form of novels. Infant in the sense that by itself it's not anything special. Outside of the creative environment and the other ideas to mesh with and grow, be revised and harmonized, it is but a small child who does nothing but tell you their idea for 5 seconds before completely forgetting it ever existed and moving on with their day. It might get a reaction of, oh, that's cool, but then again, it might not. This is all, of course, assuming it's even a good idea. So, what does all this mean? Let me summarize it real quick. Ideas are important to the process. They're how you decide what kind of story you want to write, but they're not in of themselves stories. It is important if you get an idea for a story to write it down with any other thoughts surrounding it that you can muster. You would be amazed how fast the human brain can forget the totally cool thing you thought up last week that you were definitely going to do something with, and now you've lost it. Unfortunately, given the nature of YouTube video essays, I can't give you direct feedback on any ideas in this video outside of this moment in time, but I would love to discuss ideas in the comments if you guys have any. I can also illustrate some of my own personal examples of how I got some ideas and how I've used them to construct some story prompts. But before I do that, we have to talk about genre for a hot second. So this is one of those foundational things that unfortunately you will have to take care of before you get any sort of deep level of developing your story. Your genre and you knowing and being able to explain your genre to people is an immensely important part of the process. The first thing someone asks you after they know you write books will be, "Oh, what kind of books do you write?" If you stutter and go, well, it's not really bitten to one genre, it's kind of like this whole new kind of thing, it's that kind of story, you know? They are most certainly not going to know, and regret they ever asked you, as they are now more confused than ever. Now, you can have stories that aren't 100% one genre. I would say that every single one of my books is a blend of a few genres. But you do need a main genre, and even having some relatable stories you can point to as familiar would help like crazy. For example, when I'm asked this question whenever the topic comes up, my response is typically something like this. "Oh, what are some of your hobbies?" "I read a lot, write a lot too. Got about a dozen books I've written over the last 12 years. "Oh, really? What kind of books do you write?" Well, being a larger number, it's a bit more of a variety, but generally I like to write about science fiction and fantasy. There are usually elements of mystery and horror throughout, but those two are usually the big ones. If you're familiar with Stephen King's works or Brandon Sanderson, sort of similar fields as they're writing in. "Oh, okay, got you." And the conversation will continue on from there. People generally have an idea of science fiction and fantasy, but I would even argue that those terms have been generalized so hard that going by definitions alone, I wouldn't classify my own stories with them, even though those are the genre elements that they're most closely related to. However, by using some bigger names who have established work that people may have at least heard of, you give a much cleaner frame of reference. I think giving two names is good because it shows you're more working in a field of others versus, "Oh, this is the guy who's trying to cling to Stephen King's coattails." But of course, your mileage may vary. Now, genre is a hard one to pin down sometimes. Sometimes the definition of a genre comes when you partially got your story going, and that's okay. So long as before your book is finished you have some idea of what kind of story you're telling, you should be okay. Now, I want to go back to ideas, as they pair so kindly with genre that often it's the fuse that gets your story to exist. Now, I've got three examples here, three of my books that have each come into existence by way of three entirely different methods of idea generation, so I can show you just how different this process can be even for the same person. First up is the first novel I ever wrote, Telos. This is the second book I've ever published, and it's the second novel of the Red Oaken Line saga. I've told this story before, but this book originally started life as a fanfiction for the visual novel 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, and it was titled Year Zero. I've mentioned that 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors was the story that got me to be a writer, and that is not hyperbole. It was directly after experiencing this story's insane twists and turns, of which I'm currently covering on my channel, wink wink nod nod, this will give you further insights to this specific example, that I immediately began drifting my own version of the story. The spoiler-free version of this recap is that 999 is a story where 9 strangers are kidnapped and forced to play a death game where they must try to escape a sinking ship within 9 hours. And by doing so, they encounter various escape room puzzles for mysterious ends, lest the ship sink, and they all die. There's obviously so much more to the story, but that's the gist for right now. The elevator pitch, if you will. Don't you worry, we'll be talking about boiling your story down to an elevator pitch much later. So with Year Zero, I basically took this setting, this death game, and how it worked, and inserted my own characters into it. I created original characters that were loosely based off of ones from the game, but different enough that I wouldn't be sued to oblivion. This is called taking inspiration. Now, I joke, but they really weren't developed enough to even be considered characters, but that's another topic altogether. Basically, I went and wrote 4 novellas that acted as separate arcs, taking this setting and my characters and just seeing what would happen. The ending of the story is very similar to that of the game, at least at the first arc, because realistically, I was 16 when the story was written, so extrapolating new details was not fully out of my toolbox yet, but I continued the story thereafter. 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors has 2 sequels, but by the time I experienced the first game, the second game wasn't out for a few months, and the third wasn't even a thought in anybody's mind yet. So immediately, if I were to drag out this piece, we would immediately be able to see where the storyline diverges after this fact, where I didn't have space from the game to continue. So I started gathering ideas from other stories and things that I liked and often hyperfixated on at the time. Funnily enough, at the time, this was mythology, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Was so often a part of that, due to its own Egyptian mythological influences and its own storytelling, that the second, third, and definitely fourth arcs of Year Zero hard shifted into a more mythological slant, while trying to keep up with the themes and characters established before. Is it a good story? No, I can still remember various parts of it and instantly know where I would fix it nowadays, but of course, I did that. Revising and revising eventually brought out more of its unique elements, shed some, rest in peace, Egyptian myth elements, and helped bring what was originally a fanfiction story into being the prequel story of the first book I ever published, Radical 9. More on that book in a second. Now, if you're a fan of 999, would you be able to look at Telos and be able to see what parts were inspired by this original story? Well, I hope so, because I kept them in because I love this story so much. But you will very quickly begin to see how the story has grown with each individual choice I've made, with each idea that came to me, that it's no longer a 999 fanfiction. It started that way, but it doesn't have to stay that way. Obviously, that meant a lot had to change, shift, be edited ad nauseum, but in the end, it was in service of the greater story. Going back to the first book I'd published, Radical 9, now this story is pretty funny. I was really getting into watching anime at this point in my life, outside of Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, which were my bread and butter. I was in my sophomore year in high school, and this was when Sword Art Online and Attack on Titan started getting really big. I clung to Sword Art more at first because the concept was interesting to me. A VR game where if you die in the game, you die in real life. The first season grappled me with its storytelling, but there were always aspects about it that I wish were toned down. And if I'm not being subtle enough, I think the series is pretty bad about how it treats women overall. It's very cringy and harmful, and otherwise what I would consider to be a major stain on a really good concept. It's a shame that light novels aren't that much better in that regard, but man, I sure did try to give it a chance. Herein lies the, wait, I can do this but better, story idea. Radical 9 was born out of spite, but through this journey grew into the beginning of an entire series. Radical 9 is the story of Andrew Kress, who gets trapped inside the VR video game Elysium, while the world around him is in disarray from a governmental shutdown and social crisis. His family, namely his younger sister, has to deal with his escape into Elysium while he tries inside to survive, much less come out a better person than when he went in. There are many characters at play in the story, and I wanted it to be a focus that there were strong female characters that weren't just fan service or used as damsels in distress throughout the development of the work. Of course, being a young writer at the time, my experience with writing such things was not exactly matching my aspirations. But later rewrites has made this story into something closer to what I originally intended. Lindsay Barron and Aria Avery are 2 very fun characters who both suffer a lot in their lives, but take that suffering and use it to do such amazing things. Jen Kress, of course, is a favorite. Gone is the bratty younger sister archetype. I really wanted to make a character that had her own agency and sense of self and could hold Andrew's feet to the fire when he tried distancing himself from his problems that he created and tries running from. Now, the danger in writing a story with this framework, or even the fanfiction framework, is that you're obviously borrowing a lot on credit and need to make sure you pay that back with original ideas, concepts, characters, endings, that sort of thing. If you're doing a one-to-one remake with 1 or 2 things changed and trying to pass it off as your own, people are gonna find that really suspicious. That's not inspiration, that's theft, or very badly advertised fanfiction. Now, they say stealing from one source is theft, but stealing from many sources is inspiration. And I understand where this quote is coming from, but you can in fact steal from many sources and still be stealing. James Somerton. The trick, I would say, is blending ideas together, abstracting ideas together. The concept of Radical 9 is very Sword Art Online on a first glance, but I immediately added focus to the world outside of the game itself. The state of the United States following an implied government shutdown means that Jen's storyline outside of the game has much more intrigue and possibilities for the story to follow that are entirely original, such as her and her friend Jake Carraway going to investigate the wasteland that is Denver, Colorado, after it looks like it's been blown to smithereens by nuclear warfare, because Jake's father has intel that the creator of the game was said to be working out there. This, or taking a separate perspective from Lindsay within the game, who is inside for her own reasons and motivations, hinting at her home life, and then this entirely separate storyline featuring the game master of the whole deal, Jack-A-Data, the antagonist of the story, and that story is also ultimately followed up on in Telos and beyond. There's a lot more here than just the front story of the virtual reality video game, and it's those pieces of intrigue that carry you after you understand the concept and are ready to trust that there's more inside a crack open. Both of these books have inspiration from other specific works as a base for their starts, and it's very clear that there are some of these earliest books that I've ever written. These books are still as valid as any of my others, but I highlight these here because I want you to know that it's okay to be inspired by things you like. We all are. It is okay to write things that are similar to the things that you like. Many times I'm seeing on forums and subreddits are people terrified out of their skin wondering if they're going to get canceled online for daring to write a story that is too close to a story they like or that is popular. Now, there are definitely more specific discussions to be had about specific cases and trends and the like, but generally, yes, you can write the story that excites you, even if it is similar to another story out there. It can be a fanfiction in its entirety. You're allowed to do this. Now, publishing and monetizing that side of it is another can of worms entirely. But if it gets you excited and it gets you writing, you don't need my permission to get going. But I hope you know you have my support, because I've been there. I've been in that doubt, that questioning. And now here's where we shift over to my third example, and this is actually one of my newest works in progress, titled tentatively Deus Ex Machina. This is a novel I began last November as my NaNoWriMo novel, and is currently about half finished at the current time of recording. This novel is a fantasy set in the world of Atharia. Many kingdoms and principalities clutter this nation, and we focus primarily on a young boy named Malachi in a floating city of Kadeen, who is tasked with delivering an all-powerful sword to the Empire of Orleth, the continent's strongest superpower, as a form of political blackmail for Malachi's father, who used to be a soldier for the Empire. The adventure is going to take Malachi all across the edges of this continent and find mysteries he's not prepared to face as the gods above have eyes on his travels. This may sound like it has a central inspiration like the other two, Aragon maybe, Brandon Sanderson maybe, and in some lights you might be right because I do like each of those stories and authors, but the actual idea that sprung this story to life specifically was none of those, and the entirety deals with the ending of the book. Now, I am going to be taking this novel and attempting to traditionally publish it, so I'm not going to talk about specific details here because I don't want to jeopardize those chances. But I will generally reveal that the concept that got my brain stirring was taking a cliché ending and making something really cool out of it. Endings are important to me, and sometimes when an ending is so cool, it can really elevate everything that came before it. Also, on the same hand, when an ending sucks, it can totally ruin everything that came before it. They're important in that way, as they're what your audience members most recently remember when they finish your story. So I'm really excited to explore this idea further and what it means for this book. But even with that, the idea of taking a cliched ending and turning it into something new and fresh instantly changes how I'm thinking about the rest of this story. This story is a fantasy, the most fantasy of a story I've written yet, and that means I had to think very hard about the world Malachi lives in, what kind of people that live in this floating city are, how they get their food, make trade, etc. All of that's more detail for world building, but these were the thoughts that started swirling in my head once the concept began. And from one idea became two, and from two, 10, and from there, I had an idea for a prologue, and then the ending, of course. So everything in between is where it's going to begin to form. So here we have 3 entirely different ways you can build a story, and I have even more. Each one of my books has spawned from some different combination of factors in my life, the stories I've absorbed, and each one lent to a better story in the end because of where they began. So take focus of your life, of the things you find yourself imagining. What if you were to take a few of those ideas and combine them together? What about a recent dream you've had that's had an interesting premise? Ever have a dream where Freddy Fazbear was haunting you through the streets of Galahad Fortress from Xenoblade Chronicles? No? Well, that'd make an interesting prompt for a story, no? What would William Afton do in the world of the Bionis and Myconus? How would Mechon affect his story? I came up with that on the spot in the script writing process, and I can already think of the story of a puppet master of sorts lending his services to the greater war of that game, even if you were to do a Xenoblade fanfiction or crossover. Or just make that idea completely original and take that and start with it. Ideas are themselves just tools that we use to make stories, so I think it's important you get yourself in the mindset to finding them more out in the wild. And I think that's going to be it for this first part here. I will say I'm going to be constructing a story in this series using the principles that I am talking about so that you can see my thought process in motion. So that way it's not just me talking about stuff. Unfortunately, it's not going to be considering the story of Deus Ex Machina, which is my current work in progress, but I have such a bad attention span, I'm working on multiple projects at once. So I will be offering up another story which I'm going to be self-publishing, because it is the next 12 Monoliths book. This book is tentatively titled Death of the Good People, and is a direct sequel to the first 12 Monoliths book, Good People Die. Now, the title is going to be another topic of video entirely, of finding a good title. I will talk about my process for what made this title. You might be able to see some of the connections here, but I'll talk about what makes a good title in that video. But for this story, the concept that I had in mind that birthed this plot was life after a death game. That was the phrase that entered my mind because so many stories, many of mine included, and stories that I like, are centered on the act of the death game. There are so many times where I want follow-ups to these stories of what happens after. What do these people do after they've been traumatized by such a horrific event? And it is the number one thing I want to see most from the Zero Escape series, which inspired Good People Die enough in its own ways. That'll be its own topic, I think, to maybe dissect all the ways that did that, because that story also was birthed from a Zero Escape fan fiction of a sort, but another day, another day. So I wanted to do a story that was a follow-up to a death game. Good People Die is the first 12 Monoliths book, and is also the first in establishing a backstory for a character before 12 Monoliths kind of really gets going in book 4. I wanted to follow the events that are implied at the end of Good People Die, and that's what led to the current project that I've got going. It's not far in development, it's still very early, and there are more aspects that I'll talk about in the next video that I'm adding to this book from more ideas that I've gotten. But that's my prompt, is a life after a death game. And I am very lucky in that I have a base for characters and a world that I've established, but I'm going to be going through this process as if I have not done that, or at least explaining the decisions that I've made, so that if you are following along or have ideas, I'm in here for this journey as well. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. If you want to talk in the comments about any ideas, obviously if you are looking to be traditionally published, you should talk about your story ideas with close friends. Be wary about posting it online for everybody to see. I just want to make that very clear. I'm going to be open with my self-published stories because I'm not worried about what publishers are going to think about me sharing that online. It is much different with traditionally published stories. And getting into which side of that is going to be one of the early videos as well is which should I do? Should I traditionally publish or should I self-publish? Obviously, I self-publish, so I'm going to be a little bit more biased, but I am attempting to traditionally publish Deus Ex Machina, so I will have more things to talk about as I'm going through that process. I'm going to stop rambling now. I wanted to keep these relatively short, but very concise and dense with detail. So if you have any questions, let me know down below. If you are self-publishing a work and want to talk about your idea in more detail, my Discord is in the description. And I hang out there and talk about all kinds of things. I want to make it a space where people can talk about their creative stuff and be excited and maybe get advice outside of these videos as well. So yeah, head in there if you're interested, and check you guys next time.